question I have to ask is, do I have chocolate cake in my tea? Thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure it is to come to Graduate House. It's been a couple of years, I think, since I was here last, and it does remind me a bit of my own experience living on campus at St Hilda's College, for undergraduate on-campus living. But that idea of the community being so important, I think in St Hilda's our motto was communitas, which was above all else, think of your community, and actually that's certainly stuck with me for my years so far, and I can see that through Graduate House and its alumni and its members, it sort of has that same notion of think of your community, be part of your community, and contribute to your community. So today, Keith says I've got 25 minutes. And I'm going to be talking through some of my research, but trying to bring that back to the really important questions about what should we as adults be looking for in our health professionals, and over time we find ourselves having to see health professionals more and more for various different reasons. And in this day and age, doing that well is so important, and actually taking control and ownership over your own health and well-being so that you can live as connected as you can is really important. So this talk is researchy, but the underlying thoughts is how do we make sure we can access healthcare in a way that is right for us and is going to mean we can live as best we can. So it's a little bit of a pokey title. Everyone says they're doing it, but are they? And essentially that's what my research has asked over the last 6 years or so. And now, as a CEO of Better Hearing Australia in Victoria, I've been able to take that way of thinking a little bit beyond the university sector into an organisation whose values really align with making sure people get the help they need with hearing loss. And I'm learning much more about how you redesign health systems to match consumer needs, so taking research into practice. But you are not going to sit here and listen without having to do some work. Yeah, sorry about that. So let's get a little bit warmed up. I want you to have a look at this picture here. It's a drawing which I did while doing my PhD, and in part of my doctoral studies I actually filmed consultations across Australia between older adults primarily and audiologists, so the professionals who work with hearing loss and hearing aids. And I was watching these videos and I was interpreting and observing communication, verbal communication, but we all know that verbal communication is just one part of how we communicate, and non-verbals in fact can be so powerful and in many cases more powerful. And so I found myself struck by certain scenarios and the non-verbals that were going on. And to set the scene for this talk, which is all about how do we access and create healthcare scenarios that are about the consumer, about the person, the individual, I want us to observe what it looks like when perhaps things aren't quite going how we want them to. So, if you don't have a mouthful of dessert, put your hand up, because I'm really interested to know what is it that you observe in this drawing here. Who's in this drawing? What's going on? What's the vibe? Skepticism on the part of
the person
who's being addressed. So that would be the lady on your right. What makes you say skepticism?
The body language.
Yeah. What is it about her body language?
She's slightly averting, she's slightly questioning, and she's not really convinced about what she's doing.
Really interesting. Really interesting. I'm just going to check that. Can everyone catch what was said there? She's averting her eyes a little. She doesn't look quite like she's agreeing with what's going on.
She's not quite convinced about the message that
she's not convinced about the message that's being conveyed to her. Yes.
But I think she's actually pointing her right ear towards the speaker.
Oh. Well, she is as well.
Pointing her right ear, which is
rather than like.
You reckon it?
So we've got a bit of skepticism and a bit of an argument going on over here.
Our table.
Our table always does.
Could well be that she's purposefully presenting herself in a way that so she actually could be better, which was Rod's suggestion. So someone back there, yeah.
Well, dare I say, I think that's the consultant on the audiologist or whatever on the left. He looks a bit conceited.
What makes you say that?
Well, just the way his eyes are a bit narrowed, and it's almost like he's looking sort of a little bit disinterested, a little bit disconnected. It doesn't look like he's meeting her eyes.
Interesting. A bit disinterested. Yeah. So what was that last thing you just said?
And he doesn't look to be on her level.
Not on her level.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you can interpret that, but actually you can physically see he's not on her level. He's physically
Yeah, it's actually elevated as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
which has an impact.
And the guy at the back looks like he's smirking at I don't know, he seems to find it ludicrous, the whole situation.
Yeah, right. And who do we reckon that fellow is in the back corner? That's the husband.
That's me saying, are you finally listening? My wife only has half the hearing I have, and she's got hearing aids. She won't persevere, and I said, for goodness sake, put the right one in for 2 days, you get at least one here. Put the left one in for another, and can get used to it.
Oh, that's great
But
advice.
she's still giving that look, see that look she's giving this young lady? Anyway, that's me sitting at the back.
No, that's great. It's not a too different scenario to what this really was, yes.
I'm impressed that she doesn't seem to be subservient to her husband, that she's concentrating and what he's looking or saying doesn't seem to be affecting her.
Nice. And so you think she's not affected by the clinician or
No, more the relationship with the husband.
yeah.
You know, the expectation often is that, well, what will my husband say if I'm interacting like this, whereas she doesn't seem to be concerned with that.
Yeah, a great observation. And you might be interested to know that the actual story that was going in here, I just didn't draw it, but for much of the appointment, the husband had the newspaper open. But he was there, which was great.
But it depends which newspaper it was actually.
We could go a long way into that. So if you were to say, if you had a piece of paper in front of you that said, does it look like this appointment is empowering the client, the older lady here? Does she?
She's in control.
Yes or no?
She's in control.
You think she's in control? One vote here.
No, I don't.
Wendy, you think so? A few no's over here.
She's a negative thing.
You feel it's negative?
I think she's saying, you think you've got all the answers, but you don't know what I'm going to do.
Oh, I see.
That's a lovely summary. Your sense is she thinks, you think you know all the answers, but you don't know my story. That's a wonderful segue for me to go on with the talk. Because in fact, the point of this picture is to illustrate what person-centered care is and perhaps what it isn't. What it is setting up a situation in a clinical perspective where the person with the condition and their family members are involved, empowered, and treated as individuals, and that you care beyond the condition that they've got. You care about their life and their emotional well-being and physical well-being. And so the absence of those things is not patient-centered care. And starting with the end in mind, can I say that the whole point of person-centered care is that you never, ever get there. Because it's a mindset of doing better, always looking for ways to do it better, meeting each individual where they are. And so the very title of this talk, everyone says they're doing patient-centered care, to me says no one's doing patient-centered care. And I love this cartoon because I think it illustrates that very nicely. It could be any health professionals in the car, it could be the government who are funding health systems, it could be consumers sitting in the car aiming for, striving towards person-centered care, but we will never get there. But the very fact that we're in the car heading in the right direction is so important. So that started with the end in mind. Here's the spoiler alert. What I'm going to tell you in this talk is that hearing care as it stands at the moment is not as person-centered as it needs to be. So we can just us all go back to some wine then, I think. I'll take a step back and really contextualise why I'm even talking about this topic, why hearing is important and why we need to be providing person-centred care in hearing care. And what, interestingly, in putting these presentations together, I'm struck that there aren't really good infographics about Australian hearing loss statistics. So this one's from the US, so we have to do a bit of maths, lunchtime maths, to convert this to our population. But essentially, hearing loss is the second most common chronic health condition in Australia. Did you know? Fun fact. It is more common the older you are, so over 80 years of age, 80% of people have hearing loss. The frequency or the prevalence is really over 50, becomes exponentially more common. So who wants to tell me how many million Australians that is? If we say 1 in 4, about 4 million, yeah, 1 in 6, 4 million, which is a lot of us. So it's very common. But we also know that it is not common to seek help for your hearing loss. There are various reasons for that, and that is a whole other conversation to have. And then people, like your example here, who choose to get hearing aids, the actual success rates of wearing them well and finding that they have a positive impact on your life is a proportion again. So 4 million with hearing loss, it's about 40% who get hearing aids, and then it's about 40% of people who have hearing aids who wear them successfully. Now that's a big question. Why on earth is that? So there's been lots of research done about that over the years, and one of the most consistent findings is it's because hearing aids alone are not the answer. And hearing aids are incredible pieces of technology if you have them, but they aren't a fix-all. And they need to be provided with the right education and support and right family members or conversation partners involved to actually get used to the adjustment. We often compare them to glasses, but I think actually a more appropriate comparison is to getting a prosthetic leg or arm, where everyone knows that that has to be tailored specifically to your leg. It's got to be made for you, tweaked for you, but then you have to learn how to use it, and that's going to be hard. It's going to take perseverance, and hearing aids actually are very much like that. There is quite a significant process of getting them right for you, and then adjusting your life, your new life, I guess, with hearing aids. And the trouble is, the way the system is set up presently, it's really about handing over a hearing aid and seeing you in a year. And that's complex in itself, but it primarily comes back to how hearing services are funded. So, if we think then about a huge number of Australians who have hearing loss, we also know that there's a big gap between people who have hearing loss and who have, and I hate the word, but being rehabilitated appropriately or wear hearing aids or communicate well with their hearing loss. We need to then look at, well, what are the models of care that bridge that gap? What are the things that improve how a community and how individuals cope with conditions? What are the other things that are needed in a healthcare system that improve quality of life beyond just the device? And that's what where person-centred care sits. That's that idea of the way care is provided or services are provided actually improves outcomes. So this image here basically illustrates the benefits of person-centred care across any health sector, be it a hospital, GPs, physiotherapists, dentists, Chinese medicine, anything. Providing care and services in a person-centred way leads to better patient and community experiences. The workforce is more satisfied and less burnt out. Better clinical outcomes, be that whatever clinical scenario it is. For audiology, it might be greater uptake and success with hearing aids. And ultimately, it also leads to reduced costs. And so the picture to me is pretty clear. But if we go back to that picture, if we're never actually there, it's a hard thing to take, to say, well, how do we strive to do something that we never necessarily achieve? Popped off the screen. So, hearing loss, it's important to look at how services are provided in hearing care, and one aspect we need to look at is how person-centred those services are, And so this is basically where my research career started, which was sitting down with a group of adults who experienced in hearing care and asking them, well, what if it was truly person-centered? It was really about you and your needs, what would it look like? And let me tell you, they were very, very empowering and interesting conversations, and I was so honoured to sit there and listen. But in short, what I found was that adults who have hearing loss, if they were designing the hearing system for them, it would look like person-centered care looks in any other scenario. And this is the results, I guess, out of that thematic analysis that we did. But what you might notice right in the middle is the importance of the therapeutic relationship, of the trust, the connection. Margaret, I think you used the word connection, between a clinician and the person living with the condition. You've got to be on the same level, on the same page. And that was very much true of people in this study. In addition, they talked about being involved, and that was in decisions about what we're going to take on, what I'm going to do about my hearing loss, but also having family members involved. So having them present in the room is one thing, having them sitting up and equal contributors to the conversation was another. They highlighted the importance of being informed, so it's not the same as, it's not handing over a shiny brochure with gorgeous people wearing hearing aids saying this is the one for you, it's also $8,000. It was talking through, look, there are several options. These are the ones that are suitable for your loss. These are the reasons. What other information do you need to help you make that decision? Being informed. And likewise, that informed went backwards, that the clinician needed to invest in knowing an individual's life. Ask questions beyond, do you have a hearing loss or a balance condition? What do you do? What keeps you busy? What do you enjoy doing? What is it in your day that you find most challenging with your hearing? What do you find most enjoyable? Understanding that person's life beyond that clinical scenario. And lastly, that their services were individualised, and I have quotes that go along with this, but one of the quotes here is very Australian-centric, I've realised. I've presented some of this work overseas and people just go, don't know what you mean. And the quote is, I want to be treated like I'm not just any punter that's walked through the door. Punter is a very Australian term. And that idea that, I don't want your spiel about how it is, what my hearing loss is and what hearing aids are. I want it to be tailored to me. Of course, if it's going to be tailored to me, you have to know me enough to be able to tailor it. So in this research program, if we were asking the question about, well, are we providing person-centered care? The first thing is to understand what person-centered care is, and then the second question to ask is, well, is that what is provided? So, next part of, there's another great quote, that came out of this research, which I think actually sums up person-centered care really nicely. One very intelligent gentleman said, I look in your office, I see you've got your certificates on the wall. I assume you've got your technical, audiological skills. What I really value are your interaction skills, how well you can connect with me and build that therapeutic relationship. Excuse me, and he went on to say, I happily pay 10-20% more for that relationship and to know that you've got my best interests at heart. All right, so if we want to know then what people do, does it match the idea of person-centered care? What we did then is to go and look at real appointments, and we were very fortunate to have clinicians around the country put their hand up and open their doors and say, yes, you can observe me. And can I say that's a very gutsy thing to do. I have an incredible amount of respect for them. And these results are in many ways not a personal judgment on them, but actually an observation of the system as it is. And the very fact that they were willing to be filmed says that they're the type of people who are probably on the journey themselves. So lots of words on this screen. Essentially, we filmed appointments, 63 of them, and there were 26 different clinicians. In 17 of the appointments, there was a significant other there, and it was a bit of a mix between whether it was the husband or the wife. What we did notice, though, that there was great variation in how long the appointments were. On average, an hour, from half an hour to an hour and a half. And what I will point out is that almost every single person was diagnosed with a hearing loss. And almost every single person was recommended a hearing aid. there was a very big variation in the level of hearing loss that was observed, from very minimal to very significant. But you'll get a sense that if we think of that idea of individualised, everyone's recommendation and treatment plan looked very similar to the answer. So we had these videos and we decided to look at them in several different ways. There was a method for actually watching the videos, which I did, and pulling out the verbal communication. We also had a specialist in conversation analysis, which is where they actually transcribe the conversations, and they use all these fancy symbols to denote whether someone's got louder as they're talking or whether they had a different tone of voice and whether the conversation overlaid, you know, because of course we talk and we talk over each other, or we're giving and yes while someone's talking. And that gives us a much better sense of the consequence of saying certain things in a certain way. You can see how the person responds. And then we also did a very simple thing, which was actually, once we have the transcripts, you can go and go on Microsoft Word and you can look at the complexity of the language. It gives you a grade level of flesh communicated. And that essentially gives you a measure of how complex was the language used. It's meant for written word, but it's been used a few times to look at the complexity of verbal language, because there's a whole body of literature around how complex should our language be around health literacy, basically. So we did those 3 analyses. And what did we find? Well, in our findings, and I'm going to present them basically juxtaposed back against that initial triangle, what is person-centred care? I'll talk you through them before we come back to the question. Everyone says they're doing it, but are they? So, did we observe interactions where our clients or the adults with hearing loss felt informed? Well, what we noticed were things like, from the very moment their consultation started, clinicians tended to interrupt their clients after 21 seconds. And there's a very famous study that's been replicated a few times in the GP space, where GPs tend to interrupt after 18 seconds. Is anyone a GP in the room? Should I check that place? But you know, it's interesting. GPs typically have about 13 minutes per consultation. So 18 seconds of 13 minutes is actually a bigger proportion. 21 seconds out of an hour on average is actually much smaller. And what I love about this is when they weren't interrupted, people only spoke for twice that. And you know, we actually all have a sense of social grace, really, that we know, okay, I'm going to talk, I'll get out the things that I want, and then I choose to stop talking. So encouraging clinicians, just let people talk without interrupting them. It will still be less than a minute of your time. And what people said in that 40 seconds was so important, because it was the front of mind. It was, I'm here because these things are important to me, and actually it saved time in the long run, because you got out much of the really, really important information. So there was this idea of being informed. So that's the idea. Was the clinician informed? Well, perhaps not, because they didn't necessarily give their clients all the opportunities to share their story. If we continue along that vein, audiologists tended to ask closed-ended questions of a biomedical nature. Now, it is important to ask some closed-ended and biomedical questions, which is, have you had a history of medical conditions in the year? Have you had surgery in the years? Medication-related questions, they're important, but it actually dominated the conversation, the history taking, such that questions like, how is it impacting you day to day, having this hearing loss? How do you feel about it? How does your husband feel about it, or your children? They arguably are the most important questions from a person-centred perspective, but didn't really get the same airtime. So, there's certainly scope to increase the person-centredness of being, particularly in the history-taking phase, as to where the clients were informed and where the clinicians were informed about their clients. Were they involved? So involvement, we're looking at things like decision-making and equal contribution to the conversation. What we noticed in terms of the question asking was it was very much clinician focused, and that is typical of a practitioner-centred way of working, that I'm here with my expertise, and I'm going to ask the questions that I need to ask, and then we'll move on to the next phase. It's not the same as person-centered care, where you'd actually see opportunities for the client, for us, for the consumer to say, oh, I have a question about blah. So you actually ideally would see a more 60-40 split there. Certainly the audiologists talked more, and this was even the case in the history where really that's about the consumer, that's about us telling our stories. Still the questioning dominated the responses. And we didn't see a great contribution of significant others, and that was a really interesting finding to go into more, but basically significant others weren't invited into the conversation. Like the gentleman we saw in the first drawing, he was invited into the room, tick, but he was sat in the corner and not engaged in the conversation, and so we didn't really get the rich information that you might hope from talking to a couple about their communication, for example, and because it is a couple or it is a family difficulty if someone has a hearing loss. What we noticed was also in the appointments that were shorter, the audiologists had a tendency to take over more. But once we looked into that in more detail, we noticed actually that appointments were more efficient when the clinician handed over the control, because they got to the important information quickly, and they were able to address people's concerns much quicker. And I'll talk to you a bit more about addressing concerns later. And certainly when it came to decision making, it was typically that the clinician handed over usually one option or perhaps two, but only if the first option was discreet. So it might have been, here's a hearing aid of X number of dollars, that's the best one for you. No, thank you. Oh, okay, there's also another option, and that kind of conversation went on, and you can see how that would drag out. If you say no to everything, you might have eight options, but if you knew there were 4 options in front of you from the outset, that conversation is actually much more efficient and empowering. What about individualised? Well, we certainly saw that most of the information from the audiologist about hearing loss was tailored quite specific to hearing aids, and there are many other things audiologists can do for your hearing other than hearing aids. There's a lot about communication training, there's a lot of other devices outside of hearing aids that can help in day-to-day life. What we did notice, going back to that Microsoft Word calculation, this was a very happy day when I figured out how to do this. It revealed basically that when the audiologists used more simple language, so their language was more equivalent of a grade 3 to 4, as opposed to 9 to 10, year 9 to 10, people were much more likely to choose to get hearing aids. So people, you sort of think, oh, I don't want to come across as simplifying it or dumbing it down too much, but in fact, getting to the point in simple language was empowering for people, and they could participate more in the conversation and were much more likely to then choose, yep, this is the right thing for me to go forward. And as I mentioned at the start, in most of the consultations, hearing aids were recommended, so the treatment plan it didn't appear to be particularly individualised. It was that this is what I know best, this is what I've been paid for perhaps, so this is the thing I'm going to recommend to you, almost irrespective of what your results were. And lastly, the last piece of the triangle was the importance of the relationship. So irrespective of all of that, perhaps they really invested in trust building, rapport building, and that sort of connection. When we looked at the type of language you would have or see when building relationships, we actually didn't see a great deal of that either. And a good example of this is that in instances, half of these appointments, people raised concerns, quite overt concerns, and in all of those instances, the concerns were not addressed effectively. And usually the response was taking it back to a conversation about hearing aids. So an example would be, look, I actually think I feel like a hearing aid would make me look old, quote unquote. The clinician would say something like, oh, actually, hearing aids are tiny, no one will see them. Let me show you. What could have been another question or comment that you could make after that? If you were to say that, what are you really thinking? Do you have any thoughts, Brian? What could the clinician have said?
Why would you say that?
What makes you say that? Yeah, so actually using that opportunity to better understand that person's concerns, and if you better understand their concerns, you can actually make sure whatever you're recommending suits them. It may well be that a hearing aid is not what's right for them, given where they are in their thinking. In the analysis we did look at whether talk was emotional or whether it was medical or practical, and we did very little emotional talk. This is so interesting because actually hearing loss has several significant psychosocial consequences. So in your psychological well-being and your social function. So feelings are actually important to talk about, but you have to build the relationship well enough in order for people to be comfortable talking about feelings. And we certainly know in the literature that if you don't address and understand people's emotional concerns with their hearing loss, they're not going to be successful with hearing aids. And so there's certainly scope to spend more time having those conversations. I've already talked through that. So in summary, you could probably tell me the outcome, the summary of all of that. But basically, it was common for people to raise concerns in these appointments and they weren't addressed effectively, which had consequences for how efficient the appointment was, and actually was in many ways detrimental to building that relationship. If you're saying, hang on, I have a problem, and someone's not necessarily acknowledging it or helping you solve it, I know you end up feeling a bit disappointed about that and distant, much less likely to want to go along with whatever's the outcome. And we did see several instances where in the end people said, all right, I'll trial hearing aids, and followed up with them. All of those people whose concerns were not addressed chose not to go ahead with hearing aids. And so in many ways they just said yes, just to sort of finish the appointment, which of course is not the ideal outcome. So, this brings me to the elephant in the room, and back to the question and the point of this talk. Everyone says they're providing person-centered care, but are they? And so I think that's such an important question to ask. And with these results, which is just one example, and similar research has been done across different fields of healthcare, I think it's not just asking the question, are you providing person-centered care, as these reporters might be over on the side. It's the elephant in the room about what are the real barriers to providing person-centered care. It's not just encouraging people to be better at it. There are some significant systemic and educational and structural problems that are meaning that our healthcare system isn't tailored to the needs of us as the consumer. So the upshot of this research findings is that there's a long road ahead, but I'm very positive about that road, and certainly in presenting this research I've found that people are very interested to get in the car and start driving in the right direction. I think that's the most promising outcome. But if you were to ask me, well, what needs to be done? What are the elephants in the room? We could talk a little bit about that. And certainly at the university, where we have the Master of Clinical Audiology, I would say audiology education plays a big part in this. Robin, my colleague here, and I have supervised a PhD student who's just finished a few months back, and her PhD was looking at the educational barriers to teaching our students to be more person-centered. And we realised there are some internal barriers, but they're also external, in that the university can't be expected to solve problems that exist in a professional culture. And there's this really interesting interplay. You teach students, I don't know if any of you are health professionals or have been involved in teaching health professionals, but you can teach students something in the beautiful surrounds of your university setting, but then of course they're out in clinical placements or they're junior employees, and they start seeing the real world, and the values of the real world can undo a lot of the work that's done, and vice versa. But absolutely there are changes that can be made to the education of audiologists and others who work in the hearing sector. Professional culture I mentioned. There's certainly a culture in audiology to focus on hearing aids and really value knowledge around hearing aids, and there's been sort of a forgotten part of the profession, which is essentially a counselling aspect. That comes back to the universities. It's also been dropped out of the university, so there's a chicken or the egg set up there. The professional culture is very tightly aligned with the funding. So at the moment we have a situation where the government funds hearing services for pensioners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, adults under 26, adults and children under 26 years of age, and it's an incredible internationally renowned system. But they fund hearing aids. They actually don't fund the service and that whole experience. And so there is actually a consequence that if you fund the hearing aids, then that's what's going to be the primary focus of the outcome of the system. And that in turn influences how organisations are set up. So in audiology, the big players in the hearing care sector are multinational companies who in many instances are owned by or very closely aligned with hearing aid manufacturers, who then have control over the protocols and what's focused on in the appointments. And we're very fortunate that we still do have a strong group of independent audiology clinics who for the most part are owned by clinicians, and so their values can be slightly different, but they of course find themselves competing with these big players who can get hearing aids for much cheaper, and so all of these barriers are intertwined, and I think we can make little wins across all of them to start making a change. And I know certainly Better Hearing Australia, I've got my colleague Tony who runs the Brisbane organisation. That's absolutely what organisations like Better Hearing are about, is sort of transforming the system by making sure that services beyond hearing aids exist and the consumers' voices are heard. So, I am very interested in your thoughts on all of this. And in talking to Tony before here, it is a fine line for me to walk to say, really the upshot of this presentation is that I want for us and anyone you come across when you're talking about hearing to empower people. Absolutely do something about your hearing. It's really important to do something about your hearing. But be in control. Research where you go. Don't stay with someone if they're not providing person-centred care, and give them that feedback. And know that this is about you getting the solution you want rather than the system taking you through how it wants to be. Thank you.